Hello and welcome back to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you all with us today on Tuesday, November 29th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by a distinguished panel of folks here to discuss an issue that emerged this past summer about whether public tax dollars should be used to support tuition payments for students attending religious schools. With us today to talk about this issue, we're pleased to be joined by Representative Kathleen James and Representative Seth Bongartz. They represent the Bennington 4 District in the state legislature. Also great to have with us today Mark Tashjian, the headmaster of Burton Academy, and Jim Salsgiver, the chairman of the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union's Board of Directors. Thank you all for making the time for this conversation today on a busy day. This past summer, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a ruling in a case known as the Carson versus Macon, and this is a case that grew out of a situation in the state of Maine, which has a similar educational landscape to Vermont's. Both rural states allow families and towns without a public school to use tax dollars to send their children to a public or private school of their choice. And in the Carson decision, the Supreme Court ruled last June that Maine could not exclude religious schools from its school tuitioning program. And as was reported at the time, in 7 days, the newspaper published up in Burlington, at the heart of the Carson case was the question of whether or not state governments that subsidize private education should be required to fund religious instruction. The case was brought by two Maine families who live in rural areas with no public high school, and they argued that the state was obligated to pay for their children to attend Christian high schools as part of its tuitioning program. Maine law, meanwhile, states that public dollars can be used to pay tuition to private schools only if those schools are secular. So the Supreme Court ruling states that Maine's exclusion of religious schools was unconstitutional, and the majority opinion said that Maine's current tuitioning system amounts to, quote, discrimination against religion, unquote. So the question for us today is what are the possible implications of this decision for Vermont, which has a very similar educational structure as the state of Maine? This past September, the Vermont Department of Education sent out a letter to all the schools and said they must make payments to religious schools so long as they are meeting educational quality standards of approved schools. So that's something we might want to talk about a little bit later. But first, Representative James, let me start with you. You sit on the House Education Committee, and I'm confident that you'll be probably tackling this issue come next January or when the session begins back in a couple of weeks up in Montpelier. I was wondering if you could just bring us up to speed on what you think will happen in the Education Committee on this issue.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess with the legislature, it's never wise to confidently make predictions about anything. But, you know, I want to just, I guess, establish a little bit of context for what this legislative year is going to look like first, because I think this is going to be a factor. We're starting a brand new biennium. We have, I believe, 40 to 50 brand new members.
Closer to 50.
Yeah, closer to 50, which is almost a third of our body, has just been elected. They're coming in from scratch. We have an unprecedented number of new committee chairs, and we don't even have our committee assignments yet. So, you know, it's a little preliminary to be predicting what the legislature will do. And I think what we need to remember is that there's both a challenge and an opportunity in the fact that we have so many new members, because this is an issue that the Senate spent some time on last year. They passed a bill over to the House in May, which I'll talk about in just one second. But the House didn't even have a chance to take it up. So the challenge is that this is a very complicated issue. There are a lot of new members coming in and returning members who haven't had much of an opportunity to really think about this. But that's also an opportunity, because it means that we have a chance to try to have some really thoughtful conversations and really try to make sure that we're thinking about this issue in a comprehensive way. So that was a long answer saying we got a lot of new folks. Things may not move as quickly as we would like. S-219 was a bill that Senator Campion introduced last year on the Senate side. It did pass the Senate. As I mentioned, it bounced over to the House Education Committee in May. It was very close to the end of the session, and everybody knew that the Supreme Court was certainly going to come out with a decision. It was the decision of House leadership that it would be wise to wait and see what the Supreme Court ruling was, and make sure that we didn't get out ahead of them with a bill. You know, you can argue that decision all day, but bottom line is that's what happened. So I do think that this is going to be a high priority of the House this year, or at least among our many priorities. I'd be shocked if the House Education Committee didn't take it up. I hope that we can pick up where S219 left off. And Seth, I don't know if you want to fill folks in on S219, what the bill said, and what the path forward might be.
S219 had two key provisions. One was that no school receiving public dollars could discriminate against any of the protected classes. And it also said that it could not be, that those dollars, if sent to a religious school, could not be used for the teaching of religion as opposed to the rest of the topics that will be covered in the school setting. And so in many ways, that bill now, although it is technically dead and has to start over, that bill really provides the path forward. The simplest path forward was just to simply pass legislation that says that public dollars cannot be sent to schools that discriminated against any of the protected classes. That's what most people are concerned about. And that's the narrowest path forward. There'd be some other little things we have to work into that bill about reporting and whatnot, and any complaints on how that would all happen. But the key is to take that key part of S219, which was really its purpose, and which was really its fundamental purpose, and to simply say that public dollars cannot go to schools that discriminate against any of the protected classes. And that could potentially just deal with the issue. Simple fix, and we're done. And that's certainly where I believe I wouldn't ever dare speak for you, but that's where I think we are both. That's where I am.
You may speak for me.
Okay, in that case, then that's where I think we both are, and we hope we can convince our colleagues to take that narrow path forward.
Okay, well, Mark, let me turn to you then. I guess the key question, I suppose, from your point of view is, does the Supreme Court decision obligating the state to pay public tuition dollars to religious schools impact independent schools like Burn or Long Trail or some of the other independent schools around our area?
So the short answer is it should have almost no impact whatsoever, on our communities or on Burn. Taken as a ruling, all it does is open up the possibility of however many families want to find a religious school. It gives them the opportunity to go find that religious school for their high school education. The overwhelming majority of families in our communities choose Burn, and I would expect that to continue. So the ruling itself, to me, has almost no impact whatsoever on our communities, nor will it have any impact on Burn. The only impact will be if there is some onerous, broad-scale reaction, legislative reaction that would limit families' abilities to access Burn as a school in order to prevent those small number of people from going to a religious school.
And I guess
Simple
that might come into play if the legislature were to decide that, well, the simple solution is to, just eliminate, payments to any schools.
Right. Right. So
religious or secular.
Right, and that's the classic case of the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because some small number of people may choose to go to a religious school, let's eliminate the possibility of, right now we have probably 650 or more students who are choosing to come to Burn. Let's cut them off too, in the interest of preventing this Supreme Court ruling from being implemented.
I guess I should maybe turn back to you folks. Do you think that that's a possibility, that solution might be considered, hey, well, this is the easier way out?
Anything's possible. I hope that we're able to convince an overwhelming majority of our colleagues that that's a drastic step that isn't necessary. And I think that's where, certainly where my conversations will hopefully begin. One thing I did want to mention, and then I'll bounce it to Seth, is an important factor here are the new State Board of Ed rules. And so in addition to S219, which passed the Senate last year, which we just talked about, the State Board of Ed underwent a very thoughtful and comprehensive process to update its 2200 rule series. And those rules now very clearly state that any school that is approved to receive public tuition dollars, whether it's religious or not, in Vermont, must comply with the state of Vermont's anti-discrimination laws. So we already have a robust rule series that says if you want to receive public tuition dollars, you may not discriminate. So we have this rule series in place now. There's a complaint system built in so that parents, a community member, a school district that feels that that one of these approved schools is discriminating, they can lodge a complaint with the State Board of Ed, and the complaint process could result in that school being, I guess, disapproved or disallowed to receive public tuition dollars. That's an important piece of the puzzle because in and of itself, that could represent a significant part of the solution, that existing rule series. There was a little bit of question last year about whether Vermont's anti-discrimination rules, the Vermont Public Accommodations Act, does in fact apply to religious schools. If there's any question about that, it would also be, I would hope, a relatively simple matter for the legislature to open up that, the Public Accommodations Act and make it crystal clear.
Well, Jim, let me bring you into this here. I guess I just wondered, what is your sense of this from the public school perspective?
We had some significant concerns and started discussing. Essentially, we have a very unique system here. You know, we have a great partnership of public schools and independent schools that has been wonderful for our kids. You know, as a school board, our job is to get our kids the best education possible. And we think we've been doing an outstanding job in our area. And we're very proud of that. And I think our communities and parents and kids and all are very protective of the system we have. But, you know, sitting on, it's actually the Vermont School Board Association, where I'm on the board as well, gives them the opportunity to interact with school boards and school board members from all around the state. And I've been on that for a number of years, and we've tried to educate people over time that our system is unique, it works very well, and you know, it should be an example for others rather than a target for others. Mm-hmm. However, it's very, when we are this small niche, it's very easy for people to come to conclusions that, oh, we can fix this whole thing doing something extreme like, let's just stop paying tuition to any independent schools. And from our perspective, that's an absolute non-starter in our area. It doesn't work for us. It would be an absurd, actually, outcome for our area. But it's not easy to educate people in other areas that aren't used to seeing something similar, that is not the right solution. So we had some real concerns and started discussing, and we're trying to stay in touch with all of our partners here, legislative and independent schools, because we actually passed a resolution. You know, our concern was there's enough impetus at the national level because, you know, at the national level, our sort of structure is unusual. It's, you know, Maine and Vermont are kind of similar. And so with the other 48 states, it's easy for them to say, oh, let's just get rid of these, you know, tuition things. Within the state of Vermont, we were sort of somewhat unique. You know, there are a few other communities that have a similar situation, but we're somewhat unique. And it's easier for people to reach that conclusion of, oh, here's a quick fix, just, you know, get rid of all the payments to independent schools. We, as a district, we were enough concerned, we started discussing it, and we started discussions with others. And we actually passed a motion at our November 1st board meeting, specifically stating that this is the Taconic and Green Board, that the board supports our educational system as currently written in our laws and as currently practiced in our district. We want to make it clear, as a school district, it's very important for us to figure out solutions. We don't think we can necessarily, we need people like, you know, Kath and Seth and support from people like Mark to accomplish this, but we want to be a part of hopefully ensuring that the solution is a logical solution.
And that was, by the way, a very helpful resolution. That will be helpful for the two of us in Montpelier.
So we were very concerned about
Yep.
what could come out.
Yep.
We're not concerned about the approach. We supported S219 as a district last year, and we encouraged it getting passed. And honestly, though, one key thing to note is, this gets presented as all about religious schools, but we've kind of taken it as a district to recognize that, we do have an interest in ensuring that all the schools that we do pay tuition to, which is, we're extremely happy with this school that takes 85% of our kids, and
Thank you.
long trail about 6% of our kids. About another 4% go to other public high schools, at least 5% amongst all different schools. The system works very well. We want to support that, but we also said this is a good opportunity for us to look at, what we as a board are supposed to be doing is making sure that all our kids get the education they should. And so maybe we should, for K to 8, we operate those schools, 9 to 12. We should probably be making sure that all of our 9 to 12 partners, the people we're paying to, are providing, not just religious, but that they're providing our kids with what we want to see our kids get.
Because I was thinking, this case here in Maine that the Supreme Court decided that grew out of a high school case. So this wouldn't apply to like the kindergarten through 8th grade range, I'm assuming, right?
That's a really good point, because the reason it doesn't matter to most people is because most school districts in the state operate K to 12, pre-K to 12. We operate pre-K to 8, and so it's not really an issue for pre-K to 8. But 9 to 12, where we don't operate, any grades that a school district doesn't operate becomes open for the paying of tuition, and that's where the issue comes in.
It's interesting to me. I was thinking about this that there are only 2 states where this legislation would apply, or this decision. I mean, what happens out in states like Montana or Idaho or other rural states? I mean, do they have high schools all over the place where this kind of issue just doesn't come up?
Most states have public education through, in all the grades in almost every location, and their independent schools operate and still can supplement the system and be good choices for kids, but it's not generally paying tuition for those kids.
It's interesting here, and I don't know all the history of it. Seth is more of our history buff. But what's interesting to note here is that here in Vermont, anyway, Burton's founding predates the establishment of the public school system in Vermont. So BBA's been around since, what, 1829?
1829.
Right? And so we have historic academies here that were built up, operating and serving our communities before the public school system kind of grew up around it. And so that's a history that, I don't know, maybe just because of those deep, deep roots, maybe that's why the difference between that and a young, upstart, newer state like Montana.
Right. No, it's true, right?
It's true. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I guess I was wondering, just to go back to the letter that Secretary French put out about as long as they are meeting education quality standards. What's the difference there? Are there approved and unapproved independent schools?
It's actually education quality standards are part of the criteria under Rule 2200 that Kath brought up. Because, it's interesting, in the state of Vermont, one of public schools have a whole bunch of rules. There's Title 16. There are a whole bunch of rules as to how they have to operate. And independent schools, there's a separate set of rules, which are essentially Rule Series 2200, which is overseen by the Agency of Education, State Board of Education, usually involves outside accreditation organizations.
Yep.
And it's a full process that is a rigorous process to determine, in the end, what they're determining is whether schools are approved or not. And that's essentially the state putting their seal of approval that these schools are approved, and now the Secretary's letter actually stated we'd have to pay tuition to any approved schools. And it's important to note that what Kath brought up, which is that Rule Series 2200's been around for a long time, but it's gone through a couple of major upgrades in recent years, the most recent one being June 22. And that was the addition of discrimination.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, you really said it, but just to be clear, there are schools in Vermont that are not approved. They tend to be newer, and it might take them a while to get approved, but there are schools, so the tuition dollars go only to schools that have been approved. So that's what that part of his letter is about.
But one of the tough things is that the approval process tends to take quite a while.
Right.
To get
And it can be a slow process. And so there are schools, and like with the rules just being updated this past June, there are schools that have been, we know schools whose approval ran out, over a year ago. They applied for getting reapproval. They haven't gotten to the front of the line yet. So there's a real lag in, Burton's an approved independent school in the state of Vermont.
Yep.
But there are some.
When you think about elegant solutions, right? There are the disruptive solutions that really up in the apple cart, and there are narrow, more elegant solutions. And this conversation makes me wonder if, as part of the work we could do around a bill like S219, maybe we do need to take some sort of look at the approval process, because, if that's sort of a broken machine or a slow machine, that could be AOE resources. I don't know what the holdup is, but it probably shouldn't be taking that long.
It's multiple parties involved, and it can get bogged down in multiple places.
Yeah.
So it is a process that really could use streamlining.
Interesting.
I think the important part, one important aspect of Secretary Dan French's letter is simply what he's doing is saying the Supreme Court ruled, and his guidance coming from the Agency of Education is therefore, do as the Supreme Court has ruled. If there is an approved religious school in your district, they become eligible for tuition dollars in the same way Burton is. And I think that I personally think that the really important add-on is what Kath is describing, which is I don't think any of us want to see schools receiving tuition dollars that actively discriminate against protected classes. And I think that is the overarching concern of most, not of all, but of most, about this ruling is, does it open the door to dollars flowing to a school that could have a distinctly anti-GLBTQ plus perspective? And if that's the case, they are discriminating in their hiring practices or in their acceptance practices for students.
Or their operational practices.
Or their operational practice. And I think that with that fix, defining what it means to be approved, and you don't get approval if you're engaging in discriminatory practice. That solves the problem for most, or the concern for most of the Carson versus Macon ruling.
I think it's worth going back just for a second. You asked a question about whether there will be those who say that we should simply not send any tuition dollars to any independent schools. The answer to that question is yes. There are going to be those advocating for that in the legislature because that's the position of some. What we're obviously working toward, and we've been doing a lot of quiet work in it before the session. What we are going to try to educate people about is, number one, the chaos that would result from that, because there's a hell of a lot that happens if that were to happen, and it would be total chaos here. And I don't think people have most people have no understanding of that.
And the chaos would be that
there's no place to go to school.
No place to go to school, right? Right.
And
which
so-
none of
and
us
so-
want.
yeah,
Whether you're
which is-
looking out
which
for
is nuts.
communities, kids, or the schools.
So obviously
themselves.
that cannot happen, and it won't happen. But the real thing is to get people to understand that the narrow, threading the needle fix will work just fine and will get us through this. There is no problem other than the fact that the court ruled the way it ruled, and we have to adjust for that. There is no problem. There's no problem here. Things are working well, as Jim said. We've got an amazing school system from the pre-K all the way through school, some of it public, some of it independent. It works really well for this area. Like, just our whole message is, leave it alone, it's working fine. And we do have to thread this needle, but let's just thread the needle and leave it at that.
What do you all think about the decision? Did the Supreme Court get it right in the Carson case? Mark, you started with
See, you're fishing for controversy here.
Yeah, that's my job.
I will say, I don't really have a strong opinion. I'm not going to state a strong opinion on Carson versus Macon. I will say I have great respect for the law of the land, and the Supreme Court has ruled, and I don't think any of those 9 justices really care what Mark Tashjian in Manchester, Vermont thinks. And the decision is not going to change, so I'm a realist. I'm ready to live with it.
Yeah. Jim?
No, I definitely agree with Mark. I think, that's essentially, that's where the state came down, because there were several cases in process where the state was being sued on this issue. And the state, after Carson v. Macon, essentially went to settlement and said, essentially, we lost. It's put, from a school board perspective, it's put us in a difficult spot, because essentially they signed an agreement where the Secretary of Education said, essentially, the old law, which was Chittenden, is no longer relevant. But that isn't the proper legal process to change the law in the state of Vermont. And so the laws in Vermont, haven't, I think they're moving in the direction of they're going to have to, sync up with federal law, but they don't right now. So you actually have this strange dichotomy of the state law versus the federal law. But I think we generally know where that's going. But it's created a difficult situation for us. But as Mark said, I don't think the Supreme Court cares about Jim Salsgiver's view either. So they by virtue of being the Supreme Court of the land, they rule.
They get to do what they want. And two of you, any thoughts on?
I'll say, obviously, I agree. It's the rule of the land, and what we think isn't going to make a lot of difference. I will say I wish they hadn't ruled the way they ruled. I wish these states have traditionally, within their own constitutions, been clear about not sending dollars to religious schools. I wish the Supreme Court had respected that, but they didn't. So it doesn't really matter. And it has, what it's done is thrown a wrench into the system here, and we now have to get the wrench out of the gears in a way that allows the gears to continue to turn, and that's what we're really talking about, and that's our goal. It's a great analogy. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great analogy. I don't have much to add. We'll respond, and the legislative process will work the way it always works, which has room for a lot of voices and hopefully a good resolution to this.
I think the key thing from our perspective, I think all of us sitting here, basically what we're focused on is what's best for our kids and our families. Yeah. And the net result is we really appreciate people working to find solutions that recognize we're a different animal here, and that has to be accommodated. And so we have to come up with a solution that'll work for us as well as as everybody else. And in the end, we want to hold on to the system that we're very proud of, the system that educates our kids.
Okay. All right. Well, we will leave it there for today. But I want to again thank everyone who joined us here on the panel: Representatives Kathleen James and Seth Bongartz, Jim Salsgiver, Mark Tashjian. And thanks to all of you as well for watching and being with us today. Hope you found our program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care. Thank you.